All right, so it's 7 o'clock on Monday, June 6, 2022, and I'll call the meeting to order. Is there any declaration of pecuniary interest or general nature thereof? Okay, seeing none. So before we get into the rest of the agenda, we'll just go around the room so everybody can see who's here. So up front, we have our clerk, Mike Barnier, myself, our CAO, Morgan Calvert, and then Coulter, if you want to push that button there. Our Deputy Mayor, Marianne Hendricks, our Treasurer, Johnny Pereira, and Public Works Manager, Coulter Cahill. And then on the screen, we have Councillor McKinnon and Councillor Sue Clark, as well as Andrew Neely, our Drainage Super. And then Councillor Brody wishes he could attend, but he is busy tonight and is unable to. So we'll hop into the minutes of the previous meeting, and those were held on May 6, 2022. Mover and seconder for those. Okay, Deputy Mayor Hendricks and Councillor McKinnon, all those in favor, and that's carried. And before we get into our delegation, I just want to mention that on Friday we held the grand opening and ribbon cutting for the Kerwood Park, and I think it went really well. We had a great attendance out there, and I just want to say thank you to Coulter and his team for making the place look great, and everything was all completed. Everybody was very impressed with the facility, and we're looking forward to phase 2 of the park improvements that will be underway in the fall. And I hope everybody that's watching live on YouTube right now or later on takes a chance to check out the Kerwood Park. Councillor McKinnon.
Mayor Curtis, could I make comments now or under other business in regards to comments that I heard at the park on Friday? Would you prefer it under other business later on?
Are they positive comments that don't have discussion, or if they are discussion subjects, we'll talk to it at the end of the meeting?
All right, we'll leave it until other business then.
Sounds like a plan. All righty, so we have we did the minutes, I think that's what I said. Before we get into the delegation, which is the asset management plan, what we're going to do, if it's all right with our clerk, is jump into the first staff report, which is the Two Hill Drain, just because it's should be quite quick, and we know the delegation will be a little longer, and then Andrew can carry on with the rest of his day. Is that okay, Mike? So Andrew, I'll have you go through your report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a very simple procedural type of thing. The background to this is that the municipality received a request under Section 78 to initiate the process, and at one of the more recent on-site meetings, it was brought up that there were more issues that needed to be addressed, and so the scope of the project expanded. And as a result, in order to follow the Drainage Act, it requires us to add a petition to the existing project, which is on the west side of Kerwood Road, which would tie into the drainage works that is being reconstructed. And also on the east side of Kerwood Road, the property immediately on the east side, there's going to be a reconstruction of the drain and berms added to provide anti-erosion measures that everyone in the area seems to be aware, and the property owner is aware that this has been going on for the past number of years. And so that's where I recommend that council receives the petition for the property owner owned by Mike Sanders of Concession 5 Lot 6 of the former Metcalfe Township, that that the municipality appoints Spreet & Associates to add a branch to the Two Hill Drain, and that council receives and appoints the Spreet & Associates to Section 78 of the Drainage Act for the property owner Robert Edgar of Concession 5 Lot 7, former Metcalfe Township, and that all of this be added to the existing report that is ongoing right now.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Is there any questions or comments from members of council? Okay, seeing none. So the recommendation in front of us, if we have a mover and seconder. Okay, Councillor McKinnon, and seconded by Deputy Mayor Hendricks. All those in favor? And that is carried.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. And you can enjoy the rest of your night. Okay. So we have a delegation that we'll jump back to, and it's the asset management plan. And I'll hand it over to our treasurer, Johnny Pereira, to introduce the delegation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through the council, we have Peter here from Watson and Associates. We've been working with them since December of 2021, going through and working on the asset management plan for the township to get that passed before the July 1st deadline. So I'll pass over to Peter to go through the presentation.
Perfect, and thank you very much, Johnny, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen to bring the presentation slides up, and then we can get started. And I believe we should be live on the screen.
Yep, looks good.
Excellent, thank you for the confirmation. So as mentioned in the introductory comments, Watson Associates were retained to help the township develop a comprehensive asset management plan. As mentioned, we have been working closely with township staff since December of last year on the development of this asset management plan. And so I'm really pleased to be here this evening to present the findings of the asset management plan. And so firstly, in terms of what the asset management plan is, it's really a comprehensive long-term plan for the township's capital assets. And when developing the asset management plan, we have specific regard for several key items, including the levels of service that are supported by the township's assets, and setting goals or targets for those levels of service. We also take into account the full life cycle of the assets, which we'll get into the details of shortly, and also various legislative requirements, specifically the requirements of Ontario Regulation 58817, which requires municipalities to develop an asset management plan for their core infrastructure assets by July 1st of this year, and then requires municipalities to include all of their capital assets by July 1st, 2024, and then also to include a assessment of the proposed levels of service and a detailed financial strategy by July 1st, 2025. With that said, the township is well ahead of the regulatory timelines with the asset management plan that's being presented here this evening, having been designed to meet all of the regulatory requirements all the way to July 1st, 2025. So in terms of our plan for this evening, first we will go through all of the major components of the asset management plan using an example of roads, just so that we can get into a little bit more detail of all of the major components of the asset management plan. And then subsequently, we will go through a higher level summary of each component of the asset management plan for all of the assets, looking at both the overall summary of the assets that are included in the plan, providing an indication of the scope, the replacement costs, evaluation of the assets, as well as information on condition. We will look at the current levels of service that are supported by those assets and what the proposed levels of service are for the future. We'll also look at the lifecycle management strategies related to the assets. And finally, a financial strategy that has been designed to support this plan. And then finally, we will wrap up with a brief discussion of next steps. So first then, in terms of the detailed review of using the example of roads, the first component of the asset management plan for each asset or service area, if you will, is a summary of the assets. And with this section of the asset management plan, we're really mainly looking to answer the questions of what is it that we own as a municipality, how much is that infrastructure worth, and then what condition is it in? And so using the example of roads here, we can see that the township owns and manages approximately 215 kilometers of roads, with the total replacement cost of those roads estimated at approximately $54 million. In the middle of the slide, we see the average age of road surfaces, just under 9 years for the HCB or asphalt roads, approximately 12 years for the LCB or surface treated roads, and just under 2 years for the gravel. And the age information is included for each asset category because it is one of the requirements of Regulation 58817. However, something to note here is that roads are typically managed based on
Peter,
yes.
just, are you able to hear us? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, just so you know, our hydro just blinked here at the township office, and we're just gonna hopefully get everything all back up in order. So if you just hold tight for a minute.
Okay.
Councillor McKinnon, are you able to hear us? Or anybody on the screen? Yes, okay. So you can hear us, but we can't hear you yet. And our TV screens on the wall are not up and going yet. So just give us a few more minutes.
Okay. Question, Curtis?
Councillor McKinnon, do you want to try talking for us?
Check, 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 check. Testing, one,
That's-
two, three.
4, 5, 6. We got that. Okay, we should be good to go. I'll just wait a second until somebody gives me the thumbs up.
Did that kick us off of YouTube as well?
Just about check. I don't believe so. It still says live on here, but we're gonna find out.
It should all still be running.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have the battery backup right away for the Wi-Fi connection, but not for the TVs and everything else.
Okay.
All right, so Peter, I'm not exactly sure where we left off. I know that it was approximately 7:10. So if you remember back 7 minutes ago as to what we were talking about. 54 million, that's what we all know about.
54 million. Okay, I will rewind myself to that point.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Oh, no problem at all. As long as, is everything back up and running?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. So we were just talking about the summary information that's included in the asset management plan for each asset category. And again, we're looking at the example of roads here. And so we left off talking about the fact that the current replacement cost of the township's road network has been estimated at approximately $54 million. And then I started to note that we've also included the information on the average age of the assets in the asset management plan as well. And what we see in the middle of slide 3 here is an illustration of the average age of road surfaces of the different types. So for HCB or asphalt roads, that average age currently is about just under 9 years. For LCB or surface treated roads, the average age is just under 12 years. And then for the gravel, the average age is just under 2 years. And what I was noting is that the average age information is included in the asset management plan because it is one of the requirements of Regulation 58817. However, assets, specifically things like roads, are typically managed more based on the observed condition rather than the age, and we will get to that aspect shortly. See if I can move my slides. Perfect. So the next component of the asset management plan is looking at the asset condition, both the current information that's available about the condition of the assets, as well as a general description of the municipality's approach to assessing condition. And so continuing with our example of roads here, the condition of the entire paved road network was assessed last year by a company called StreetScan. And the overall measure of condition for paved roads is the Pavement Condition Index, which is a value that's in a range of 0 to 100, with 100 being an excellent or brand new road, all the way down to 0, which would typically be a failed road. And based on that most recent condition assessment, we see that the average pavement condition index is around the 79 to 82 mark for both the HCB and LCB roads. And that corresponds to a good condition state on average based on the ranges that have been established. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, we also see how the pavement condition index values have been assigned to the qualitative condition states from excellent and through fair all the way down to serious. And what we have also included in the asset management plan are pictures where available. Sometimes it helps to have a visual idea of what the condition score represents, and the inclusion of pictures is encouraged in the asset management regulation. Then in terms of the gravel roads, the condition of those was estimated through a desktop exercise based on the time that has passed since the most recent re-graveling. The gravel roads are generally re-graveled on a 3-year cycle, and based on that cycle, the average condition of the gravel roads is expected to be about fair. The next thing we then look at, and as summarized on slide 5 here, are the levels of service. And this is quite important because we are now shifting away from looking at the assets themselves and starting to look at this through a service lens. And what I mean by that is understanding the services that the various assets support, and then understanding how the community experiences those various services and what aspects of the service are important to them. And so the levels of service framework really seeks to describe both qualitatively and quantitatively the outputs or objectives that the municipality intends its assets to deliver. And there are 3 main components to the levels of service framework. First, we have the service attributes, which capture the main characteristics of a service that are important to users and or the managers of the service. Next, we have the community levels of service or level of service statements, which describe more in qualitative terms the service itself and what the municipality intends to deliver with respect to that service. And then the final component of the levels of service framework are performance measures or technical levels of service, which are typically more quantitative in nature and allow a municipality to identify in very specific terms what the level of service is, what the targets are for the future, and then over time allows a municipality to measure its progress in this regard. And so at the top of the next slide here, or on the slide, we have the community levels of service, again, continuing with our example of roads. And the key service attributes that have been identified for roads are scope and quality. And from a community levels of service perspective, we have included descriptions of the traffic that is supported by the township's transportation assets. And then for the quality attribute, we have included the overall statement of intent, which is to maintain road and bridge surfaces to a level that supports an adequate travel experience for road users. And then finally, we have also included pictures and descriptions of both roads as well as bridges and culverts or structures in the various condition states to better communicate the various condition states to the reader of the plan. Now, the table on the next slide here includes the technical levels of service and the performance measures that are used to indicate the level of service that's being provided by the township, as well as the proposed level of service targets. Under scope, there are 3 performance measures describing the extent of the road network by class, and that's reported relative to the land area of the township. And then under quality, we are looking at the average conditions, specifically the average pavement condition index value for the paved roads and the average surface condition for the unpaved roads. And we previously looked at what those averages are. But again, for the paved roads, the average is about a pavement condition index of 80. And for the unpaved roads, the current condition state is on average about fair. And then again, the second column from the right here indicates what the current performance is, and that's reported as of 2021 because that's the last year, full year of available data. And then the rightmost column of the table shows the proposed or target level of service based on discussions with township staff. And for the time being, for the most part, the level of service targets for each service area have been set at levels that are consistent with the current level of service. So then the next major section of the asset management plan looks at lifecycle management strategies. And so firstly, a lifecycle management strategy is a plan for how to manage the capital lifecycle activities that are related to an asset, and looking at those lifecycle activities over the full lifecycle of any particular asset. And there are two key outputs from the lifecycle management strategy. Firstly, it allows us to produce a forecast of the lifecycle activities that would be required in order to achieve the proposed levels of service. And therefore, this is the piece that supports the short to medium term planning. And then the second key component or output of the lifecycle management strategy is an estimate of the full lifecycle costs that are associated with any particular asset. And this second component then allows us to estimate the amount of annual funding that would be required to sustain the assets and service levels over the long term. And so on slide 9 here, we have an illustration of the lifecycle management strategy for the HCB or asphalt roads. And what we see illustrated is that the strategy involves 2 rounds of resurfacing, which then correspond to a bump up or an improvement in the condition of the road and prolong or extend its useful life. And then following the 2 rounds of resurfacing, the road would then be expected to require a full reconstruction. And based on the strategy that has been identified, that full reconstruction would be expected to happen about 50 years out from the initial construction or from the last full reconstruction at a condition of about a pavement condition index of 30. And so once the lifecycle management strategy is defined in this way for each type of road surface, we are then estimating where each road segment is in this overall life cycle currently. And that estimate is based on the condition assessment that was completed last year, which allows us to look at the current pavement condition index value, and it allows us to estimate, again, where the road is or any given road segment is in this overall life cycle. And we are then able to estimate what the next life cycle activity would be based on where the asset is in that life cycle and when that life cycle activity would be required. And then finally, in terms of that second output from the life cycle management strategy being the average annual life cycle cost, what we see in the table on the bottom right of the slide here, that provides a summary of the life cycle activities and the associated costs. And then at the bottom of the table, we see that the total life cycle costs of a kilometer of HCB road are approximately $1.2 million. And then because the life cycle spans approximately 58 years between full reconstructions, the average annual life cycle cost per kilometer of HCB road is just under $21,000. And so based on the life cycle management strategy, we can then produce a multi-year forecast of life cycle expenditures. And we see that illustrated on slide 10 here. And we will come back to this a little bit later in the presentation once we bring in the other assets as well. So then to zoom out a little bit from our very specific example of roads to now look at all of the assets that have been included in this iteration of the asset management plan. On slide 12 here, we see a general summary providing a description of the types of assets and their extent or quantities that are included in each major asset class that has been included in the asset management plan. And what we see on the far left-hand side of the slide is that the combined replacement cost of the assets that are included in the asset management plan is approximately $89 million. And that represents an investment of approximately $87,000 to $88,000 per household. So fairly significant level of investment that's been made into this infrastructure historically. Now measured by replacement value, roads and related assets, including the sidewalks and streetlights, are the most significant component of the township's asset portfolio, accounting for approximately 61% of the total replacement value. Bridges and structures or structural culverts are the next biggest category, accounting for approximately 16% of the total replacement cost. We then have the water and wastewater infrastructure, which together account for about 10% of the total replacement value. And then finally, we have the facilities, fleet, and equipment and land improvements, which together account for about 13% of the total replacement cost. So in this next section, we'll go through the specific technical levels of service or performance measures that have been identified for all of the assets, looking at both what the current performance is as of 2021, and then what the proposed level of service is, as we see in the rightmost column of each table. And so we previously looked at the first three performance measures for transportation assets under the scope attribute here. But then what's additional on this slide 14 here is we're also reporting the number of bridges that have loading or dimensional restrictions. And this is reported because bridges or structures having loading restrictions would effectively reduce the scope of the assets for certain types of traffic. And so currently this is true for 2 of the township's bridges, representing about 15% of the total number of bridges. Under the quality attribute, again, continuing for transportation related assets, we have various performance measures looking at the condition of the various transportation assets. So again, the average pavement condition index values for the paved roads, average condition of the gravel roads, the average condition of both bridges and structural culverts, which is reported using a bridge condition index, which is similar to the pavement condition index, on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being a excellent condition. And then we also have the average condition of sidewalks and street lights. Something to note for those 2 asset categories is that those have not been physically assessed for condition. And so the condition of those assets is estimated based on the proportion of the useful life that has been consumed. And that's what the ULC percentage is. It's the useful life consumed. So if an asset is brand new, it would have a 0. And when the asset gets to the end of its expected useful life, it would have 100% of that useful life consumed. So it would be considered to be in a fair to poor condition at that point. In terms of the levels of service for water services on slide 16 here, the first 2 measures under the scope service attribute are looking at the overall extent of water services in the township, comparing the number of connected properties to the total number of properties. And then that's about 3.6% currently. And then we also have to look at the percentage of properties where fire flow is available, which has been assumed to be the same properties that are connected to the water system. And then under reliability, we look at the extent of any boil water advisories, as well as any water main breaks that may have occurred within the system over the previous year. And we see that there were none reported in 2021. And so the goal would be to maintain that level of service moving forward as well. For wastewater, we again, under scope, report the percentage of properties in the township that are connected to the municipal wastewater system, and that has been estimated at approximately 6.6% currently. That reflects both the properties in the Kerwood community and several additional properties neighboring Strathroy-Caradoc. And then from a reliability standpoint, we have to look at the extent of wastewater backups, as well as any effluent violations that may have occurred. And we can see that there were some wastewater backups reported in 2021, representing approximately 0.017 connection days per connection. And then finally, for the facilities, fleet, and land improvement assets, the level of service is reported using the percentage of useful life consumed, which is intended to speak to the overall quality of the facilities, that corresponding on average to a condition state of good. And then in terms of reliability for the fleet and land improvement assets, where again, that current condition has been assessed as being ranging from good for fleet to very good for land improvements, again, based on the useful life that has been consumed so far by those assets. So next, in terms of the summary of the lifecycle management strategies for the various assets, earlier we looked at a detailed example of how the lifecycle management strategy was developed for roads specifically. And we talked about the 2 components of the lifecycle management strategy, or the 2 key outputs. There's the generalized lifecycle model that allows us to prepare a long-run forecast of the lifecycle funding needs by looking at the full life cycle of the assets and the various activities that need to be planned for and funded over that life cycle. And then also a more specific identification of the specific life cycle needs for a shorter time frame, in this case over a 10-year forecast horizon. And so the table on the slide here provides a summary of how both of those components of the life cycle management strategy have been addressed for the various asset categories. And so we have a few different approaches that were used for assets with a well-defined life cycle and that have available, reliable data on the condition or age of the assets, is where we use that life cycle modeling approach. Where available, specifically for bridges and culverts, the short to medium term needs are based on various background reports, in this case, the latest inspection report that has been prepared, as those are updated every 2 years for the structures. So have the best information about what needs to be done over the short to medium term to maintain the levels of service in that regard. For assets such as facilities, both in terms of the general facilities or buildings, as well as the wastewater treatment plant, the 10-year forecast has been developed based on input from township staff. And then finally, for equipment, the 10-year forecast includes a more general provision for replacement on an as-needed basis, recognizing that it's fairly hard to predict when an individual piece of equipment is going to fail. And so it's an annual provision that would allow the township generally to maintain the equipment functioning, replacing it as needed. Now, for the average annual life cycle costs, in most cases, the life cycle modeling approach was used. The two exceptions to that being the general facilities and again, the wastewater facilities, for which the average annual life cycle costs were estimated based on the replacement cost of the assets. And then applying the annual reinvestment rates that are suggested for those types of assets within the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card. And so bringing all of that information together, the chart on slide 21 here shows the life cycle expenditures by year and by major asset category. And that's illustrated with the stacked bar charts for each year across the illustration here. And the average annual capital expenditures over the next 10 years have been estimated at just under $1.5 million. And that's illustrated with the lower horizontal line. Now, the long run average annual life cycle costs have been estimated at approximately $1.9 million. And that's illustrated with the upper horizontal line. And since those long run costs are higher than the average expenditures that have been identified over the next 10 years, that would indicate that the township should be planning for higher life cycle expenditures beyond the 10-year forecast period. So typically what that would indicate is that there would be a need to accumulate some money in capital life cycle reserve funds to help offset those higher than average needs in years beyond our forecast here. So next, having identified that 10-year forecast of life cycle expenditures related to maintaining or achieving the proposed levels of service as identified earlier, within the financial strategy, we are then first looking to identify the current level of life cycle funding, which is based on the township's budget. And that's illustrated with a little dot in 2021. And that current level of capital funding includes budgeted contribution towards capital projects, as well as contributions to capital related reserve funds. And it also includes reliable grants such as the gas tax and OCIF funding. And so in total, the current estimate based on this year's budget is that there's approximately $1.3 million of capital funding capacity that's built into the budget and therefore the associated tax levy. Now, the gap that we see between the current level of capital funding and the long run life cycle funding need, which again is the upper horizontal line, is what is typically referred to as the annual funding gap or annual life cycle funding gap. And for the township's assets, that funding gap is currently just over $534,000. And so in light of that, we have proposed a financial strategy that would see the township gradually ramp up capital funding to close that life cycle funding gap by 2031. So the illustration on the next slide here, slide 24, provides an illustration of all the components that together comprise the financial forecast that has been included in the asset management plan. And so I'll just step through the various components of the illustration here. Before I do that, one thing to note is that when we develop the overall financial forecast, we also include inflation. And so the illustration here is provided in nominal or inflated values. And so what we see then is the green portion of the bars, of the stacked bars in each year, represents the capital expenditures that we saw earlier. And then in addition to the capital expenditures, the illustration also includes the net operating expenditures that have been identified. And so that together gives us an estimate of the total expenditures for each year, net of any operating revenues, which could be miscellaneous permit fees or other miscellaneous revenues, for example. Now, relative to those expenditures, we are looking at the revenues that are generated from the tax levy each year. And that's illustrated with the black line in the chart. And also recognizing the expected grants, such as, again, the gas tax funding and OCIF funding, which is illustrated with the lighter gray line across the top. Now, in behind the bars, you see the light purple, I'll call it a mountain, which represents the estimated closing balance of capital reserves in each year. And those capital reserves are meant to act as a stabilization mechanism. And because while the goal is to establish a stable or gradually increasing revenue stream, to minimize drastic year-over-year changes to the tax levy, the reality is that capital expenditures fluctuate from year to year. And so again, that life cycle reserve fund acts as a stabilization mechanism. And so in years where the capital expenditures, when layered on top of the net operating expenditures and exceed the revenues forecasted for that year, the capital reserves can be tapped into to shave off that peak in investment needs. And you can see that based on the expenditure forecast for 2023 as well as 2024, there will be some drawing down of the reserves occurring in those years. And then as the tax levy revenue increases towards full life cycle funding levels, the capital reserve funds would be expected to increase to about just over $10 million by the end of 2031, which again would then be money that's available to offset those higher life cycle needs in later years. And so to summarize the financial strategy, it was developed or designed to allow the township to close the annual capital life cycle funding gap by 2031. At the full life cycle level of funding, the township would be in a sustainable position, meaning that it could maintain service levels as set out in the asset management plan. The capital and capital related component of the annual tax levy would need to increase from about $1.1 million currently to about $2.5 million by 2031. Now, recognizing that the asset management plan isn't a comprehensive long-range financial plan, we did want to provide council with an indication of how the financial strategy would impact the annual property tax bills. And in order to do that, we prepared a 10-year forecast of the tax levy requirements, which incorporates inflationary adjustments to the operating and capital expenditures, and also includes a provision for real growth in the assessment base as a result of future development in the township. And that has been estimated at approximately 0.6% annual growth rate, which is consistent with the township's historical averages. And the estimated impact is that the annual tax bills received by taxpayers would be estimated to increase by approximately 3.1% annually from 2023 to 2031, which is actually generally fairly close to overall inflation when we look at typical inflation rates to both the operating expenditures and capital expenditures. Now, just to provide a little bit of additional context to that magnitude of increase, as we mentioned, in 2022, so currently the annual capital funding gap has been estimated at about $534,000, which represents about 12% of the total tax levy. What we then did is we looked at several other asset management plans within Middlesex County, as well as the City of London, to get a sense of how large some of the other annual life cycle funding gaps are in those municipalities, again, relative to the total tax levy. And what we saw based on that little survey was that the capital funding gaps tend to range from between 26 to 38% of the annual tax levy in the year when the asset management was prepared. And because that gap tends to be larger relative to the tax levy, that would indicate that there might be higher increases required in those municipalities relative to what has been identified for the township. And so then just in terms of next steps, I think that summarizes the higher level overview of the asset management plan and the key findings, specifically around the financial strategy that would be required to support the plan. In terms of next steps, council will need to approve the asset management plan that should occur by July 1st of this year in order to meet the regulatory timeline. And then beyond approval of the asset management plan, there's going to be the need for continual monitoring of progress with respect to asset management. Typically that would be undertaken by tracking the various performance measures and looking at how those are changing year after year. And then also looking at the levels of capital funding that are being provided towards these life cycle needs relative to what was identified or recommended within the asset management plan. Some other continual improvements that the township will be undertaking is both the update of the asset inventory information within the township's asset management software to capture some of the data refinements that have been made while developing this asset management plan, and then also to implement the lifecycle management strategy models that have been defined within that citywide software so that it can more easily be, those forecasts can more easily be updated in future years. And then finally, every municipality will be required to update the asset management plan at least every 5 years. So the next formal update of this asset management plan would need to occur, again, at the latest in about 5 years' time. And so that summarizes or concludes the formal part of the presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for the presentation. And speaking for myself, it was very well laid out, and it's very clear and concise. And I think you did an excellent job with the presentation. And it's great to see this plan come before council. The one slide that I like to that I really want to dwell on is that page 26, where the gap for us is that 12% in comparison to other municipalities in the region, which is the 26 to 38%, which is quite large and alarming. So I'm quite happy to see that 12% for us. I wish that number was a little smaller, but in comparison, it's quite good to see that number there. Before I go to questions, I just have one of my own. And looking, I believe it was page 20. I'm not sure if it's a question for you, Peter, or Coulter or Johnny, but the facilities and looking at that 10-year forecast, and this was brought from staff. I was just wondering if that was looking at our works department, like our works garages as well, because I know we've talked about that at council a number of times about updating those. I wasn't sure if Coulter, you wanted to talk about that, or Johnny, or I guess Peter. Sure. Yeah, there you go, Johnny.
Yeah. So the asset management plan is looking at the assets at its current state. Mm-hmm. So any future plans to change arrangements or whatnot would be something that would be looked at in the future.
Okay, understood. Okay, Councillor Clark, I see you have your little virtual hand up.
Yes, thank you. So my first question, you've just spoken to the facilities, so that was like the different garages, so that's been addressed, I guess. I just wanted to clarify, like, so the MPAC assessment that's been built into this as well, is that the 0.6% that you're using? Like
That is
the
correct. Yes, and that's just reflective of the real assessment growth that the township has seen historically.
okay. And then my third question is there any anything in your analysis that would take into any consideration the black swan event that could adversely affect any of our capital assets?
So I think the indirectly, yes. I think the way that the financial strategy has been designed is that, as we looked at one of the previous slides, we showed that there is going to be a healthy amount of money available in the capital reserve funds throughout the forecast period if this financial strategy is followed. So that would allow for there to be some contingency, effectively funding in case any unexpected events occur.
Okay, so there is a cushion there of sorts. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor McKinnon or Deputy Mayor Hendricks, any questions or comments? Councillor McKinnon?
Yes, thank you, Peter, for describing the HCB as asphalt and the LCB as tar and chip. I had to look it up in the dictionary to see what you were talking about at first, but I appreciate that. And I wondered, under technical level of service, under the quality of unpaved road, the average condition under performance, you had as fair and then in brackets 2.2 as a weighted. Could you explain that to us? Because if you look at the fair conditions, it's from 55 to 70. So could you explain that to us?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where there was a different approach taken to assessing the condition of the unpaved roads because they haven't had a physical sort of formal condition assessment like the paved roads have had. And so what was done as part of this developing this asset management plan is, in working with township staff, we established that the condition is somewhat reflective of the time of the last re-graveling on the gravel roads. And so that there was effectively a 3-point condition scale established for the gravel roads, with, in the year of re-graveling, the condition would be very good or 1. The next year would go to a 2, and then the third year would go to a 3. And that's when it would be re-graveled. And so based on that 3-year re-graveling cycle, the expectation is, and we did look at what the timing of last re-graveling was on individual road segments. And so that average condition on that 3-point scale came out as 2.2, which corresponds to a fair condition state, the way it has been defined. So it's a different scale than what has been used for the paved roads.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. And my other question was, you had listed the types of roads as a lifespan. The HCB asphalt was 8.8 years, and the LCB, the tar and chip, was 11.7 years. And could you explain why that differs from the county roads? Because my understanding from the engineer there was that a lifespan of an asphalt road was about 5 years, and we're receiving 8.8. So could you explain that?
Yes, so the average age, I think a couple of notes on that. One is that the age information specifically for roads, there's quite a bit of inconsistency, I'll say, in how that's reported in municipal asset management plans, because some municipalities look at the overall age of the road since it was initially put in place, while others, and what has been done here, just look at the age of the road surface, so the time since the last resurfacing. Now, in terms of that average being different in different municipalities, it really depends on, again, the history of resurfacings that have been performed. So in this case, we looked at the available data about the age of the surface on individual road segments, and then came up with a weighted average by length of road. So that number, that average age, is going to differ by municipality depending on the timing of resurfacings, which is informed both by the municipality's specific life cycle management strategy and the overall level of service that they're trying to achieve as well. And also the types of traffic. Some municipalities see heavier presence of commercial traffic, which could result in quicker deterioration, requiring more frequent resurfacing. So there's quite a number of factors that influence that potentially.
Okay, and my other questions have been answered in regards to the 12% gap, so thank you.
All right, I think that's the end of the questions from council. Thank you so much, Peter, for all your help and work on this and the presentation today. Looking to Mike, are you looking for a motion from us or just?
No, through the mayor, we do have Johnny's report that's asking for the recommendations later on.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Peter. And if you want to stick around and watch Johnny's presentation, you can do so, but I'm sure you have another presentation to look forward to for another council.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you so much. And apologies for that 10-minute delay. All right, so we'll go into our correspondence now. So upcoming conferences, seminars, and meetings. Our next regular meeting is on Monday, June 20th. The Middlesex County Wardens Charity Golf Tournament is being held on Thursday, June 23rd. Four Counties Health Services Foundation, their 2022 annual golf tournament, and that is on Friday, July 15th. And then we'll get to our next council meeting, which is on Monday, July 18th. So recommended readings with the Osavo Bayfield Conservation Authority 2021 audited financial statements. Item number 2, Osavo Bayfield, again, it's their board meeting highlights for April. From St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, it's their April 20, I believe that should be 2022 meeting highlights. Blue Water Recycling, their May 2022 meeting highlights, and then the highlights from the Middlesex County Council meeting from May 24th. If there's no questions of those, we'll go into the action required. From the City of Brantford, it's the residential school document release. Okay, item number 7, it's in regards to the annual emergency exercise exemption. Deputy Mayor Hendricks.
Yeah, I had to support it. I know that I could agree with not doing an exercise when you've already lived through an emergency. I mean, something, especially if it was something more onerous than even what we had to do with COVID, which a lot of municipalities are dealing with right now. So I had to support that motion.
Okay.
I'll move that.
You'll move that. And Councillor Clark, are you wanting to second that, or do you have a comment?
I was just going to comment that I can support it, but I'd like there to be sort of a threshold so that there's a severity of emergency or something, that there's, I don't know what the right wording is. Depends on the definition of emergency, I guess. And because if somebody's, like if it's a train derailment, for example, we don't need to practice for that again. And I would say that's very severe. But if it's, I can't even think of something that would be lesser. So I guess I'd want, I agree, I support it in principle, but I think there should be some more teeth to it of some kind.
Okay.
Does that make sense there?
I believe I understand what you're saying. Councillor McKinnon.
I'll second the motion to support.
Okay. Is there any other discussion on the motion in front of us? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
And that's carried. Okay, next item number 8 is from the town of Espanola, and it's the Ukraine support. Okay. And then the last one there is from the town of Rainy River, which is a really fun name to say. It's connecting links. Okay, doesn't look like anybody's unmuting themselves, so we'll have a motion to receive and file items CC 1 through to 6 and 8 and 9.
I'll move that.
Okay, Councillor Clark and Councillor McKinnon, all those in favor?
Aye.
And that's carried. All right, so we'll jump into our staff reports, and the first one we've already dealt with, so we'll get into the asset management plan, and I'll hand it over to Johnny.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to council. As presented from Watson and Associates, we finally have our completed asset management plan. A lot of work has gone into building this plan the past year. This was a great team effort between finance and public works. As Peter explained, we managed to complete all of the Ontario Regulation 588-17 milestones under this plan, which was more efficient, completing them all at once, and provide the township with significant cost savings in consulting fees as well. As outlined in the asset management plan, the township is experiencing a life cycle funding gap, which is consistent to many other municipalities in Ontario. This highlights that we're not putting enough annually into reserves to fund future capital needs of the township. As presented earlier, a 3.1% tax rate increase annually would be something for council to consider during the budget process to improve our reserves for future capital. Now that we have a completed asset management plan, the financial strategy from this plan will be used to develop a new reserve and reserve fund policy, which will be presented later this year for council to consider. Due to the length and complexity of the asset management plan, I would like to defer the endorsement of the asset management plan to provide council and the public an opportunity to absorb this information and ask any questions. I'm hoping to bring the asset management plan back to council at the June 20th meeting for endorsement. The recommendation is to receive the information or the report as presented. I'd be happy to answer any questions they may have.
All right, is there any questions at all from members of council? Councillor McKinnon, or sorry, Deputy Hendricks. I was looking at Councillor McKinnon on the screen.
I just had one comment. They talked about doing renewing the asset management plan every 5 years, and to my mind, that kind of messes with terms of council. I think at best we should approach it as a 4-year plan, just so that somebody newly elected isn't, if they get elected at the wrong time, trying to absorb the amount of information that's in it. So I think doing it in the 3rd or 4th year of a council term is a much wiser way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McKinnon or Councillor Clark, any comments at all? Councillor Clark.
Yeah, I think that with the 5-year, you're going to have it rolling enough that you will have a different council, especially if because you'd be in year number 2 of a new term if you adopt it now. So I don't see any problem with the 5-year, because I don't think you'd want it coming due when the new council comes on. I think it's already a steep enough learning curve for a new councillor to kind of get the lay of the land for the first year and a half. So I think that with it already being in play, I think that's important.
I'm going to hand over to Johnny just to discuss the 5-year.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The 5 years, I believe, is a requirement to review it at that point in time. Obviously, we can do it sooner if council wishes. There is a cost to do that. So it's just kind of weighing that out at that time.
Okay, Councillor McKinnon.
And I concur with Councillor Sue, her remarks. And given that we have been presented with a budget from the treasurer that's much more comprehensive and it's easier to follow, I think that the 5-year term is good.
All right. And also to add to all the comments, I think going forward, when we get to our annual budget, it'll be a lot smoother, even smoother than it already has become. having this plan in front of us so then we can make sure that we're planning for future years. So it's great to finally have a completed asset management plan for Adelaide Metcalfe, and I'm looking forward to the next meeting so we can get that approved so we can move forward with it. So I think we do have a recommendation in front of us. And I think Johnny did say that. So it's that the asset management plan be received for information, and then that staff be directed to report back to council on the final asset management plan for approval at the June 20th, 2022 after council and the public has had time to ask questions and make comments. Okay, Councilor McKinnon and Deputy Mayor Hendricks, all those in favor?
Aye.
And that is carried. All right, so the next report is legislative services update, and that's from Mike Barnier. But beforehand, I'm going to hand it over to our CAO Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to note with council, management has bi-weekly meetings, so a management meeting every 2 weeks. One of the things that we were discussing is that there's a lot of things going on in the township. We owe council a lot of reports, but until we get to that point, there's a lot of information and things that we're doing that we can be sharing with council, just so you know that things are still cooking around here. So we wanted to start with Mike Barnier. We'll probably get into finance or the roads department later on, but as we move through our council meetings through the summer, you're going to see more of these departmental updates, especially when we have lighter agendas from time to time. Over to you, Mr. Barnier.
Okay, thanks, Morgan. Kind of stole my introduction there about regular updates, but so I just want to give a brief discussion. You have the report there and just a brief presentation on kind of what we're doing in the background besides the the everyday work and accommodating the public. So basically, the legislative department does provide ongoing support to all departments. So that includes expertise and advice. We do, I work with Johnny and Coulter and a little less so Morgan, but providing, when we don't have the answers, where to look, who to talk to, just some of the expertise that I've gotten over the years in different departments. And as well as just straight up clerk advice and how to proceed legislatively through bylaws, agreements. And it also includes, and it's getting more efficient. We'll get into that a little bit later, but records management and the request for documents, minutes, anything that provides a history to some of the staff that we all haven't been here, for many years in Adelaide Metcalfe. So previously it's been quite the search sometimes, phoning Curtis, trying to get a background or context on some of these situations. So it's becoming easier. We are able to bring up some of these documents and provide those almost instantaneously to staff. Always general clerical support. The girls up front, whether it's mailings, folding. We just did get a new folding machine, so that's not even a requirement at this point. Sending some of those correspondence letters on tenders to engineers, or tender applicants. And then beyond that, around all projects, everything we're doing from, even the community improvement plan, all those type of initiatives, providing communications. So that's websites, socials, online surveys, or print items. So to get into kind of the records management is definitely the focus at this point. And I've mentioned before, it is daunting, the amount of documents, but I would say we're making substantial progress. To date, I guess we do have all council meeting minutes, all closed meeting minutes, meeting agendas, meeting reports, human resource records, agreements, leases, and contracts. I would say 90% of those are in the Laserfiche system right now, and the others being scanned, waiting for an import. Okay, sorry, there's a power blip there. So kind of lost my train of thought there, but we did hire a student, Heidi Glithrow. She's out of Strathroy in her third year at the University of Windsor in forensics. And Heidi has hit the road running. We've actually scanned half of our, probably just the other day, got to half of our property files. And just explain property files, because Councillor McKinnon did ask today about what's in those and what we're retaining. So I would say the bulk of records in those property files is a transitory documents that we can purge. And there's no issues with purging them. There are things such as tax certificates, which are basically good the day that you printed them and no longer good after that, right? So what we're keeping is some of the useful historical information, septic information, some building permit information, inspection reports. If we're coming across any properties that went through any type of legal process, we're keeping those as well. So we've got half of them scanned. They're ready to be imported into Laserfish. And I should note that we're moving so fast that the county basically on a monthly basis has to increase room for us on the Laserfish storage, right? So, and I just want to highlight that we are still ensuring legislative compliance. When I say we're purging these documents are definitely not anything that we're required to keep. They are transitory. And even the documents that we have scanned in Laserfish, we haven't destroyed anything at this point. I do need to rejig the records management program a little bit, talk about how we're going to store things digitally rather than paper, but I don't want to rush and do a proper disposition when we're ready at that point. So we are working on that right now and hopefully to council soon. So getting in the scanning the documents and getting them into Laserfish is just one portion of that. We are going through, I think I provide in the report examples of the bylaws and the agreements, and each bylaw and each agreement, we have Donna templating up front, and the type of agreement, the milestones in the agreement, when the agreement's going to get renewed, they're all standardized fields in that template. So what that allows us to do, not only make it easier to search for something, using those same fields and narrowing it down, but also in a workflow scenario, when you put those milestone dates on, we are an easy workflow where agreements are letting us know when an agreement or a milestone is coming up, and it will email me directly. And like 180 days, 90, 60, 30. And then if you're beyond that, it starts to remind you every day until you clear out that. The same workflow just for council's information. You'll see a bylaw complaint form on the website. That's straight up a form from Laserfish, and it introduces a similar workflow so we can see what's going on with bylaw in that regard. So up next for record management, drainage records. And as I explained to Councillor McKinnon today, it will be a beast. Some of these documents or files and the records within them are substantial. So we'll be working with the drainage superintendent, the student, Donna and Karen, all to work together to understand and start keeping what we need to keep, keeping which is useful, and start moving them into Laserfish so they're easily accessible instead of moving to or going each time to a physical folder and searching for them. And as discussed, we'll be doing update of the records management program in general. That means policy, bylaw, the freedom of information request, just standardizing all that. I think in this municipality, as it stands right now, the freedom of information is quite prohibitive. There are a lot of documents that we can disclose, even if we're redacting some of it. So just to make that whole process a little bit easier. So obviously, I sometimes wonder if I picked the right year to become a clerk, but elections just keep me busy, and I'm really thankful for the clerks working throughout the county. We are sharing resources. We are sharing communications. We shared through that Keeping It Local magazine, election article with Strathroy Caradoc, and I thought it was really well put together at the end of it. And we're going to continue some of that in the next issue, some of the election issues. So right now, a big monster of a document is the election procedures, and it is on the website currently. It provides all the form. I forget how many forms there are, but they're all configured for us. But there's about at least 100 forms that are part of an election. So all standardized, all for us, and they are outlined in that manual and in our network directory, all compiled. Sad, well, not sad, but we do not have any nominations at this point. I believe North Middlesex is the other one. So we will be pushing the election nominations a little bit more through communications. I kind of wanted to wait for the provincial elections to be done, not to confuse anything. But if you plan to submit, I'm very happily ready to accommodate you in that regard, because I'd like to see some of this procedure going and working. So we will be promoting that in the very near future. This has taken, emergency management is taking up more time than I think it would in normal years, just because we were issued our compliance for last year, but admittedly there were some issues. We didn't have properly trained community emergency management coordinator. So both Dan, the fire chief, Dan Parker, and I are termed the alternate community emergency management coordinators. So we did take both the basic emergency management and the community emergency management coordinator course through Emergency Management Ontario. Both successfully completed those recently. So moving on, we've already started review of the emergency response plan, and members of the group will be sent soon our HIRA, or Hazardous Infrastructure Risk Assessment, to review as you're required to on an annual basis. And the last component of that is the annual exercise. Generally supportive of that, the recommendation for those that have called emergencies, whether they need to do an annual exercise again. We did declare an emergency ourselves this year with the road shutdowns. But I don't know if that would qualify as compared to what some of these other municipalities are going through. So the other thing I'd really like to turn my attention to as I get more comfortable, so the bulk of the election work being done and just being more efficient at the clerk position, is communications. Definitely have a communications background. I think you've already seen the quality and professionalism of some of our communications that go out, whether it is on social media or our newsletter, is increasing. We are making minor updates to the website on a consistent basis. I welcome anybody, and I say this to the management team. It is tough to know everything on there, especially when it's not all your material. You see a mistake, let us know. I kind of say it takes a village to raise a website as well in that regard. So we are trying to keep it to a minimum amount of pages just for that reason. I see websites that are very ambitious, but then they end up falling apart because there is too much information. So I am very select about adding some pages, but you will see probably this week both the economic development and the library pages coming out. And working with Johnny, and this was discussed recently in management meeting, better finance and kind of a capital projects page to give residents updates on some of the capital projects that we are working on. And the other one is a facility rental information. Now we do have some, now that the pavilion is just built, and we've been working with our Intact Insurance about maybe providing in-house insurance for renters at a very cheap cost. So that will probably likely go up when some of that information gets a little further down the road. I have developed a website procedural manual just recently, and so I'll be working with the front staff as I've been doing 99% of the website updates. I did teach Johnny, he's been in there a little bit updating the website, but the ladies up front, very limited on it right now. So just to get some of that work on the easy updates off my plate, we'll be providing training to them. Social media, I would really admit that it's very reactive, and when we have someone requesting, but I'd like to get ahead of that, a little more proactive, a little bit, and hopefully the girls out front can assist with this. Putting out information from other agencies, reviewing that. It's just been a little ad hoc, and I'd just like some more consistency out of our social media and regular updates. My internet connection is unstable. And the last one, which I hope to start working on very soon, is a e-newsletter. To start with, I'm thinking about a bi-monthly, hopefully move to a monthly if we have enough information and see how it goes. But basically through the e-newsletter, it's very useful because you can start to build out an email list of people and that consent to getting that municipal information, and you can start to push out other information as well. But hopefully soon we'll get a nice branded e-newsletter coming right to people's email boxes soon. I would say it's a little bit different than we talk about internet challenges. Most people can get email, and it will format right to your phone, some of these updates. So just to talk about some of the initiatives I'd like to finish in 2002, a little bit, some of it ambitious, but as we talked about, review of the emergency management program, not just to meet compliance, but to also provide an update. We're talking about building an internal shareable website in that regard called Sharepoint. Records management update as talked about. I'd like to get into at least issuing wedding licensing this year. I did take a refresher training in that regard. I did used to issue wedding licenses as well as perform marriages. Probably just getting the licensing this year, and by spring next year, start advertising for services. So we'll have another revenue stream, hopefully, on that one. Just quickly speak to cemetery management. We did, again, ensure compliance this year, but I would say that the cemetery files are scattered throughout the office. So we have one of the ladies working on starting to get that all compiled and just be in a better place, because it is tough to find directly what you're looking for in that case in cemetery. Consolidated fee bylaw, we've talked about this. This is most likely to come to the June 20th meeting. I'd like to update the procedure bylaw. It gets a little bit tricky with a new council coming in, but I'm not sure I want to wait for all that. I'd like to update all that process. I was speaking with our software provider, eScribe, and a funny comment was basically is that even for a small municipality, I have used zero of their support time. And figuring it out on my own. So they almost felt bad. So they've offered some services to us to update some of these, our agenda and reports. And I've already discussed the digital newsletter. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer. The recommendation is to receive the report.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That was a lot of information. A lot of stuff is going on in your little office there. It's crazy the amount of stuff that's going on. Is there any questions? So you see Councillor McKinnon. Yep, go ahead, Councillor McKinnon.
Yes, through you, Mayor Curtis, to Mike. Mike, will we still be sending out a hard copy of a newsletter to those individuals that are not computerized and not on the internet?
That is the plan, for at least for the short term. Still releasing the newsletter in the tax bills. There still is a use for that. And we'll probably just kind of generally judge the uptake of the digital newsletter, how well it's received, feedback. But yes, we do plan to keep issuing a print newsletter for now. But when you do break down the cost associated with print versus what we can do with digital, but we don't want to leave anyone behind too. And I'm very cognizant of that fact.
Good. And just a comment that given our track record on municipal drainage invoicing, I'm pleased to hear that drainage will become a priority. So Glad to hear that, Mike.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions at all? No. Alrighty, so looks like we just have the motion to receive the and file or receive the information, receive the update. Whatever it is. That the Legislative Services Update June 2022 report be received for information. I knew it was something around those lines. Deputy Mayor Hendricks and seconded by
I'll second it.
Councillor Clark. There we go. All those in favor? And that is carried. All right, so that is the end of our staff reports. So the next section is our closed session. So we need to have a motion from council that we adjourn to a closed session at 8:25 pursuant to section 239(2)(e) of the Municipal Act, and that is to discuss the servicing agreement between Adelaide Metcalfe and Strathroy Caradoc. Mover and seconder, Councillor McKinnon and Deputy Mayor Hendricks. All those in favor? And that is